Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to John Bentivegna, the Chief Master Sergeant of the U.S. Space Force, about the future of the Space Force, the weaponization of space by U.S. adversaries, and how America and its allies can work together in space in the 21st century. And then we break down the latest developments on Venezuela, the passage of the NDAA, and we take you inside the new system that could revolutionize military communications. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined today by John Seward, defense and national security correspondent here at the Times. Very excited to have you here this week, John. And this week's Threat Status Podcast is brought to you by United Launch Alliance. ULA delivers trusted precision launch capabilities for America's warfighters, supporting defense and intelligence missions with the next generation Vulcan rocket and a resilient U.S. industrial base. And later on this episode, I'll have an exclusive interview with Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, John Bentivegna. We talked last week at the Space Power Conference in Orlando, Florida, and Threat Status has been literally all over the country recently. John, you were with Guy Taylor and other folks from the Washington Times out at the Reagan National Defense Forum in California, and then on the heels of that, at Fort Carson in Colorado. So thanks for being here. Tell us about your time in Colorado and what you were doing out there.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for having me on. Went out to Fort Carson and watched IB Sting 3, which is what they're calling the most recent test of the next generation command and control system. The NGC2 is what everyone's sort of calling that. So the long and the short of it is they're trying to put as much information from across the Army's formations into what they call a data layer, a main data layer. The challenge with that they're working through right now is basically how do you get everything digitized, and then what are the benefits of having it all digitized? I mean, so the upsides and downsides of this that I saw was them trying to conduct some fire missions. That's where they're focusing a lot of the testing. And while some of those were successful, others were not. The commander said, the software is not quite ready for full time right now, but that he was very pleased with this past week's test. That being said, the Army is sort of calling this system, which is produced by Anduril, what the Army is also calling Team A, to not necessarily be preferential to them. They're talking about doing this as a very big lift on infrastructure to just sort of try to digitize all of the information across the force. Some examples of that were things like putting essentially like an iPad type device down in the hands of a soldier at the cannon so that they could actually count the number of rounds that they were firing, and that would immediately go into that data layer, sort of informing the rest of the formation, right? So now, instead of waiting on sort of like a piece of paper to be passed around and someone to call it up on a radio, you automatically have that round count there, and you can make decisions off of, okay, so who's got enough, who needs a little bit more, and that really sort of changes the way that the battlefield works. Another example of how they're using this is, whenever we shoot surface to surface, whether that's a cannon or a rocket, you have to clear the airspace, right? You don't want those things getting away in the way of things like our helicopters or our fixed wing aircraft. That process used to take anywhere from like 5 to 20 minutes, sort of depending on the complexity and whether or not folks were like really well trained, had all their communications dialed. The thing that they are pretty proud of coming out of this test is that they got the data layer set up to essentially make that down to like 20 seconds.
You touched on this in the examples that you gave, and I think it's just really important for listeners to kind of digest this idea that when you talk about things like data and communication systems, maybe the layman's eyes might glaze over it. That's literally, as you just described, vital to the mission. And we're talking about things that could actually save people's lives and make it easier for U.S. service members to actually accomplish their objectives in a war zone here.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we can definitely get into sort of like the uber nerd end of this, right? And talk about the comm structure and the data and all of that. But at the end of the day, and this is something I talked about with General Ellis, the goal is to make it so that commanders aren't overwhelmed with all of this data, but can make decisions faster, right? So, in very simple terms, it's do I want to take the formation left or right? And depending on that choice, means depending on running straight into the enemy and not having enough ammunition, not having enough fuel, etc., or essentially like being able to outmaneuver them and be faster, better, stronger in the fight. So that's kind of the goal there, and that's what the whole data layer is trying to enable is a commander looking at the battlefield and more making those artful decisions rather than getting like bogged down in the weeds of it, if that makes sense. I do, like I said, I want to talk about the NDAA for a second because obviously big news this week on that. As of this episode airing, the president will have signed the NDAA yesterday, and we found a number of stories coming out about that piece of legislation. It's over 3,000 pages, so obviously we haven't covered everything in it, but a couple of key highlights that we noticed. The first big thing is that the bill is aimed sort of in the same vein as what we were just talking about to do like a drastic modernization of the force, right? Specifically around procurement, basically like the military being able to purchase and buy all of their different systems. So Senator Roger Wicker, who is the chairman of the Senate Armed Forces Committee, he said it is, quote, sweeping upgrades the DoD's business practice in 60 years. So like the biggest change that we've seen, essentially. Now those business practices, those are affecting things like the NGC2 program that we just finished talking about. One of the lines of the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is actually holding half of the funding for that program until Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll makes a report to Congress saying, hey, is this actually going to do what it says it's trying to do, right? Like what's the efficacy of this here? The bill's actually going to increase the amount of Department of Defense authorized spending by about $8 billion, according to lawmakers. That's intentionally making more pathways in the bill as well for small business upstarts in the defense industry, something that we've started to talk a lot about, these sort of new hybrids involving more tech, and try to get their products into the Department of Defense. In the coming weeks, we're going to dig into a lot more of this, but last thing I want to highlight on this, the bill actually is going to require Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth to release this video that everyone keeps talking about with these strikes carried out in the Caribbean to Congress before he gets access to his full travel budget. So a little bit of like interesting political maneuvering there, right? Like it isn't normal for the NDAA to directly order the Secretary of Defense to do something in order to have his authorization, other than like, reports and updates and those sort of things. So this is rather specific.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think it just kind of, it is a little bit of political gamesmanship, I think, as you say, but like it just highlights the fact that even members of Congress are kind of getting a little ticked at the lack of information and the lack of answers they're getting out of the Pentagon, out of Southcom in terms of these strikes on these alleged drug boats. But there's even more, of course, happening around Venezuela this week, not just drug boats. Last week on the show, we talked about the U.S. seizing a Venezuelan oil tanker, Skipper, that the Justice Department said was part of a covert network moving illicit oil to evade sanctions, and that some of the money from that network goes on to support the IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Hezbollah, both designated terrorist organizations. President Trump took that a step further, or several steps further, perhaps this week, and he ordered what essentially amounts to a blockade on all sanctioned Venezuelan oil tankers moving in and out of the country. And he called the government of that country, led by President Nicolas Maduro, a terrorist organization itself. Now, we're really on a knife's edge here with this. The U.S., as we've detailed multiple times over the past few weeks, has a ton of military firepower in the region. And the president has already said, of course, that we could strike land targets in Venezuela soon. And now, just today, Thursday, as we record this, there are reports the Venezuelan Navy is going to try to escort oil tankers through the U.S. blockade out of those waters. So this could really erupt, I think, into a full-blown conflict at just about any moment now. And I detailed in the Washington Times this week why the Trump administration appears so willing to maybe let it get to that point. And there were a host of of reasons for that, for Venezuela's support through its oil of terrorist groups, its growing relationship with Russia and China, which are gaining a foothold through Venezuela in the Americas, and even the possibility that a more friendly government in Caracas could open the door for more business with the U.S. government and for private American companies. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, major gold mines, huge amounts of minerals, including some rare earths needed for cell phones and fighter jets and a lot more. But, there's also, I think, this personal element here that we can't forget about. President Trump in his first term tried to get rid of Maduro. The U.S. recognized opposition figure Juan Guaido as the country's rightful leader, and it got some other countries to do the same. And the hope, of course, was that would lead to an uprising, international pressure, internal pressure, domestic pressure on Maduro to the point that he eventually had to step down. Obviously, that didn't work. He's still there. He appears to have lost an election last year, by all accounts, but stayed in power anyway. So he's still there. And analysts tell me it certainly seems at this point like Trump views this as unfinished business, personal unfinished business left over from his first term. And is he willing, you have to ask yourself, with all we know about President Trump and all we've seen from him in his political career over the past decade plus now, is he willing to sort of do this, put on this show, send all this military firepower right to Venezuela's doorstep, and then pull it back without actually getting rid of Maduro, who the U.S. says is essentially a criminal kingpin masquerading as a head of state? Trump's facing a lot of political pressure, including from some folks in his own party, to get rid of Maduro, or this entire ordeal, the drug boat strikes, all of it will have been in vain. So we'll see kind of where this goes.
Well, and not to be too much of like a congressional security wonk here, right? But part of the NDAA this year is actually repealing 2 of our authorizations for the use of military force. Right? So that's basically like Congress's way to let the president use the military abroad. 2 of those, the one from 1991 and the one from 2002, are going to be repealed. But one of them isn't, which is the 2001 authorization that came right after the September 11th attacks here in the U.S. That authorization is the most sweeping. And I can tell you right now that some lawmakers that I've talked to have said that dynamic, especially when it comes to Venezuela and the strikes that have been conducted, the continued sort of buildup in the Southern Hemisphere, that's a very challenging dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, I think, you sort of see the little test driving when you start calling a government a foreign terrorist organization. That does give the president some leeway militarily. But we've also been hearing this argument for months now that we're at, these combatants, that we're not at war with another country. We're at war with essentially narco terrorists, and we're in an armed conflict with them. So there's a whole bunch of different legal rationales kind of floating out there. And we'll see, how they kind of coalesce if and when we actually get strikes, U.S. strikes on Venezuela. And we are joined now by Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, John Bentivegna, who serves at the highest enlisted level of the Space Force, been in the U.S. military for over 30 years. Most of that time, as I understand it, in the Air Force, but in the Space Force as of 2020. We're speaking here at the Space Power 2025 conference in Orlando, Florida. No better place to have a conversation about space and its importance for U.S. national security. It's an honor to have you here. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation with you and brag about what the Space Force does and talk about my Guardians.
Well, let's start with that. I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with this already, but for anybody who isn't, walk us through in just a minute or two what the role of the Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force actually entails and what your roles and responsibilities are.
Yeah, so each service in the military has a senior enlisted advisor, is what they call it. So my primary role as a senior enlisted advisor, or the Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, is to advise General Saltzman, who's the Chief of Space Operations, and Secretary Mink, who's the Secretary of the Air Force. And I advise them on the employment, the training, the education, the development of the force. I spend a lot of time primarily focused on enlisted matters, but my stripes, when I talk about it as being Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, my responsibility and my investment doesn't stop at stripes. So I talk a lot about development of our civilians and our officers as well.
What's it been like, sort of from the inside, watching the formative years of the Space Force? I mean, you said 2020 is when you moved from the Air Force to the Space Force. So in terms of the lifespan of a military service, we're still in kind of the early years here. So what's that been like, just watching a service kind of come from the ground up like that?
Yeah, so you're right. I was an airman for 26 years in the Air Force, and most of that time I was doing space operations work anyway, because it was a function of the United States Air Force until the Space Force stood up. So making that transition, I had a passion for the mission. I was doing it anyway. So the opportunity to help establish a brand new service was exciting to me. And it has been an amazing ride so far. I don't like to say there's still a lot of work to get done. I like to say there's still a lot of opportunity that lies ahead of us. But we've done a lot. But what really has, in addition to standing up the culture of the service and defining what we are, it's the little things that have really surprised me, like getting an ID card that says Space Force on it, getting uniforms, what's a song, what are the values, like those things that a little bit took for granted because we're established services for so many years, to have the opportunity to reach out, right, to the young men and women who have joined the Space Force and say, what do you want your values to be? What do you want the uniform to look like? What's the culture that we're trying to build? So it's a unique opportunity that my other senior enlisted advisors that I work with, a little envy, right? I got a chance to do that, but it's been an amazing ride so far.
As I understand it, the Space Force currently has an enlisted force of fewer than 10,000. Does that number need to grow? What do you want to see it at in terms of what we need to actually accomplish the mission the Space Force has been given?
So in actuality, we hit a milestone, I think, in October of this year in 2025, where we as a service exceeded 10,000 uniformed Guardians. Now that's 10,000, and that's a total of officers and enlisted. When you look at how the breakdown is between officer and enlisted within the Space Force, it's almost 50-50 right now. So it's almost about 5,000 enlisted, 5,000 officers, and about a 5,000 civilian cohort. So 15,000 total when you look at that across the service. Now, when you look at the growth, where we're going, I do see, when you think about the mission sets, the operations, the functions we're going to have to execute on behalf of the nation, I do see a growth in the number of enlisted Guardians that we have to be able to get after that mission set. Because when we define what the roles of our enlisted cadre are, right, they're going to be the individuals in the operations centers, the subject matter experts on the weapon systems, working with our deep and broad officers who are going to do integration and mission planning. So in addition to some growth in officer cadre, I do see a significant growth in enlisted as we go forward.
I want to ask you about readiness, which I know is a subject that you like to talk about. And I'm just, for sort of the average listener who may not be familiar necessarily with exactly, what readiness means from the inside, I'm curious if you can walk us through what it means for the Space Force, because I think most people can wrap their heads around, okay, we need to be ready for a quote unquote traditional fight on land or at sea or in the air. We've never fought a war in space. God forbid we never will. But what does readiness mean in a domain of space where we've never actually fought before?
Yeah, and that's a journey that we as a service have been on for the past 6 years. General Saltzman has done a phenomenal job with focusing us on how do we measure and define our readiness, especially in the context of all the other services. My Navy counterparts talk about the readiness of carrier strike groups. My buddy in the SMA in the Army talks about Patriot batteries. Right? So GPS and satellites that are in space, how do we talk about the readiness? Right. Well, when you think about how we execute on a global basis, our bases that we operate of, right, in the United States or overseas, those really are our power projection platforms. Mm-hmm. So when we look at the readiness, in addition to, is there HVAC, is there power, do we have security, do we have the backup facilities on the ground to be able to communicate and take advantage of what space provides? Then there's the training readiness of the Guardians, right? Do they understand how to engage against a thinking adversary? Do they understand the techniques, procedures to be able to, right, offset what our adversaries are trying to do? Mm-hmm. Growing that foundational ecosystem all ties into readiness. In addition to that, I spent a lot of time holistically on readiness, right? Do our Guardians and family members have access to medical care? Do they have child care? Do they have, adequate housing? All that wraps into what I consider as readiness. primarily we're employed in place forces, which means they go to work on their power projection platforms, maybe in Colorado Springs or here in Florida or out in California. And for 12 hours, they may be doing strategic missile warning, a space domain awareness on behalf of a combatant command. And then at the end of that day, they may have to stop at the grocery store, pick up some milk. They may have to go pick up their children from the daycare or from school and then do homework and fix a leaky sink, right? So, all those life things that occur, right, in conjunction with being a warfighter, because we're not necessarily deployed separated from the family, all we're focused on, we're asking to be a warfighter and a mother and a father, right, and brother or a sister. So there's a lot of holistic readiness issues that we look at from the Space Force perspective.
It's so interesting, and that's why I wanted to get your take on that, because I think too often, and those of us in the media are probably guilty of this too, of framing readiness as just purely ready to fight. Are we ready to fight in a conflict? And obviously, that's a major part of it, but there's so much more behind the scenes that I think a lot of folks don't often think about. Speaking of things that the media talks about a lot, the weaponization of space. How do you, there's, a lot of hand-wringing. Do we need some kind of new space treaty to follow on the Outer Space Treaty, the Cold War era Outer Space Treaty banning nuclear weapons and other arms in space among the U.S., China, Russia? Is the cat out of the bag in that from your perspective, as you see it? Is space already weaponized? Is it already a sort of war-fighting domain, if you will?
Yeah, space has absolutely been identified, and we consider it a war-fighting domain. I mean, that's one of the reasons as a service that we stood up. The foundational purpose of the Space Force is to provide space superiority for the nation. And inherently, right, that's a war-fighting function that we have to do. And part of that is because you look at history, like in 2007, right, China launched their direct ascent ASAT, right, that blew up one of their defunct weather satellites. Russia has proven several times, right, their ability to destroy satellites on orbit. Those are weapons, right, that they have developed. And that's just on orbit. When you think about what's on the ground, whether it be lasers or electronic warfare, trying to jam GPS, trying to jam satellite communications. So yes, the domain is considered a warfighting domain primarily because our competitors and adversaries have been investing in how do they negate this advantage that we have as a nation, as a joint force, because space underpins our lethality as a joint force. So our adversaries have acknowledged that. So they are actively trying to figure out how do they take that advantage away from us, but also how do they leverage that for themselves. China, for example, has done a lot of investment to not only try to negate our capabilities, but take advantage of the domain for over-the-horizon targeting, right? So they see the benefit of the domain themselves. So they're trying to invest in how do they leverage to get an asymmetric advantage over us possibly.
Let's drill into that a little more. What is the U.S. advantage today as we sit here in December 2025 in the space domain? Has that been shrinking over the past couple of years vis-a-vis China? Where do you see that today?
We talk China as very competitive, our pacing, right, adversary, if you will, or our pacing challenge, because they have done so much investing. I want to say probably over the last 10 years, I think it's like over 500%, right, of on-orbit assets that China has invested in. But I'd say one of our primary advantages are our people, right? Our ability to think outside the box, our ability to kind of take risk, our openness to leverage with commercial and industry, right, to take advantage of how fast they are moving, our ability to have reusable launch, which is a capability that a lot of other nations are trying to get after. China specifically doesn't have that capability yet. But I really think our people and how we invest in our, the professionalism of the military from that perspective gives us an advantage, I think, over a lot of our competitors. But I also think, and this is why our national security strategy, we have to have a strong space sector within the nation, and partnering with industry and commercial really also gives us an advantage because they are so invested in taking advantage of the domain economically, exploring, but also leads to benefits for the military aspect of it as well.
You just touched on this. I wonder if you can maybe expand on it a little bit. The idea of space superiority, maybe something like reusable launch that we have that China doesn't. Are there other specific metrics, without trying to get you in any kind of classified territory, any capabilities or specific metrics that you would look at and say, okay, there's A, B, and C. We're superior to China in all of those categories. How do you measure that?
Yeah, I would say that probably most categories, when you look at it, sophistication, capability, their ability, our ability to have allies. See, this is another important thing too. Our partnerships with our allies give us global access. And even though we're talking about the space domain, where we have access geographically is also very important to have space domain awareness. General Saltzman refers to space as the ultimate team sport, right? And not being able to do it just as a nation ourselves, it's just too big, right? And our ability to kind of share responsibility and leverage what our partner nations are bringing to the table, like-minded nations, right? We talk about behavior in space, right? That is not going to take away the domain and cause any kind of damage. That has been a definitely advantage to us when we talk about, hey, how do we approach this from a superiority perspective, which has been really important to us.
What does that look like, this idea of allies and partners working together in space? Because again, I think sort of the average listener or reader of the Washington Times can understand, okay, there's a joint drill between NATO nations, for example, or we understand interoperability in terms of ground forces, et cetera. What does that look like in space, particularly when, obviously the United States is a leader in that. A lot of our allies and partners don't have all the capabilities or expertise necessarily that we do. So what can they actually bring to the table for us from a tangible perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to one of my counterparts, another chief, Ron Lurch, who works in our S2, our Intel on the Pentagon, and he refers to it as our ability with our allies and partners to what he called chase the sun, which is when you think about the domain, is that chasing the sun, that no matter where we are on the globe, we have partners and allies that are helping and keeping awareness of what's happening in the domain for attribution, warning, and that really, when you talk about our ability with partners, is so important to be able to do that.
This is a little bit of a policy question, but I'm so fascinated by this. I'm wondering how you see it from sort of your perch, and that's the relationship between the Space Force and the U.S. military more broadly and private industry in terms of assets in space, whether it's things like Starlink satellites, for example. There's a lot of private assets in space that are becoming increasingly important for communications, for all kinds of other. So, God forbid, in a wartime scenario, if they get blown up by an adversary or compromised in some way, where does sort of the financial, legal responsibility lie? Who replaces them? Who's tasked for protecting them? From your specific vantage point, what does that look like moving forward, the relationship between the Space Force specifically and private industry that we're relying on now?
Yeah, and this has been a unique relationship. And one of the things that, the ambiguity, right, when you talk about space capabilities, because of the integration with our commercial partners, SATCOM, for example, like we lease a lot of bandwidth on commercial carriers to be able to provide the connectivity that we need as a nation. ISR, right? Because not only, right, are there farmers and transportation industry, right, leveraging capabilities that are on orbit from industry, but we're buying that data as well. Mm-hmm. Space domain awareness is a big one. We buy a lot of data from space domain awareness companies to help complete the site picture that we and our allies have from that. So Russia in itself, if you notice, Russia has talked about, especially in the war with Ukraine, looking at, hey, commercial entities that are supporting the fight, from their perspective, could be considered legal targets. Right. So that gray zone, right, the ambiguity makes the domain from a policy, a strategy perspective, very different than other domains that we have working through that. And I think as a nation, there's a lot of great discussion on what does that mean. Space Systems Command, I know, is working through the CASR, and I have to get what that acronym stands for, but that is what's the augmentation that we have, just like we have on the fleet from an air perspective. There's an agreement and a relationship with commercial carriers when we need to surge. What does that look like, and what's the roles and responsibilities from protection and reimbursement look like in the space domain? And it's an evolving relationship and journey that we're on for that.
Last thing here before we wrap up, I want to kind of ask you what the future looks like from your perspective. If we have this conversation 10 years from now, do we have hundreds or even thousands of Guardians semi-permanently in space on tours, or do we have a base on the moon of some kind? Where do you see us going militarily from the Space Force perspective in the future? It's obviously exciting. Everyone I talk to is very excited about where we're going from the future, but practically as a military guy, what do you think that space is going to look like moving forward in 5, 10, 15 years from now?
If you look at history, every domain that humankind has explored into, whether we, as we moved across land and continents out to sea, into air, where humankind goes, right, there's some sort of protection, right, and military aspect that follows them into it. So if you look at the space domain, space tourism, space transit, we're going to go back to the moon from an exploratory perspective. We're trying to get to Mars. I look at the Space Force very similar to the United States Navy, right? sea lanes of transit, right? That the navies of the world, led by the United States Navy, right, protects commerce, allows us to go on cruises, allows us to ship material, right? So I think from an economic standpoint, we move further into the space domain and leverage it more and more into our daily lives. The nations are going to demand that the guardians of the Space Force are there to enable free and unfettered access to that domain so that explorers can explore, investors can invest. So I do see, right, that the Space Force will grow. I think we will follow where we go from an economic exploratory perspective. And eventually that will probably lead to, right, actually guardians in the domain. But I think that will absolutely be a relationship and kind of following, because that's where history has kind of showed us.
John Bentivegna, Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And you know, our birthday's coming up. We're going to be 6 years old here on the 20th of December, so I'm excited about it.
This week's Threat Status Podcast is brought to you by United Launch Alliance. ULA delivers trusted precision launch capabilities for America's warfighters, supporting defense and intelligence missions with the next generation Vulcan rocket and a resilient U.S. industrial base. And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now. This week, as you all listen to the show. And John, my threat of the week is AI-powered toys. Now, I talked about this a couple months ago on the show, and it's kind of blown up even more since then, because it really seems like in addition to there being a direct danger to children here, there's also a geopolitical component involving communist China that I'll get into in just a second. But NBC News had a pretty powerful piece recently detailing how AI-powered toys engage in sexual conversations with users, presumably a lot of them kids. And there's even some disturbing content about the toys teaching kids how to light a match or sharpen knives. So that's, of course, terrifying if you're a parent. And then a couple of prominent senators this week sent letters to leading toy companies like Mattel and Little Learners seeking more information about that specifically. But what struck me is this China angle. Some AI-powered toys from Chinese companies can respond to a user's question, again, presumably a child or a young teenager, about things like the status of the island democracy Taiwan. And according to these reports, one such toy that was tested responded, quote, "Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. That is an established fact," unquote. So there's a growing fear here, of course, that China could launch a military attack on Taiwan to try to reunite it with communist China. And this would seem like a part, even if it's just a small part, of information warfare or the race for 21st century data dominance, however you want to frame it. The idea that China, through TikTok or chat bots or even AI-powered toys, is getting its talking points spread out throughout the world. And that's especially dangerous when the targets are children who are still learning. And if they hear over and over again at a young age from their toys that Taiwan is actually a part of communist China, well, of course, maybe they start to believe it. And if they become older, maybe they don't think the U.S. ought to get involved and risk our own blood and money to save Taiwan. And you can see sort of where this goes. So this is my threat of the week here, John, because none of this stuff is happening in a vacuum. China has and continues to have a concerted plan with all of this stuff.
Yeah, yet another vector, right, for them to sort of get their message into the minds of young Americans, for sure. My threat of the week, I want to highlight yet another piece from the NDAA. I know a little bit of a Congress wonk here, but our own Bill Gertz wrote, I think, a very effective article talking about how part of the NDAA is essentially resuming or approving for the continuation of underground nuclear tests by the Pentagon and the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. So the actual language here is, unless a foreign state conducts a nuclear test after this date, at which time the prohibition of United States nuclear test is lifted. Now, that date that they're talking about was 1996, and North Korea has done 6 underground nuclear tests since then, between 2006 and 2017. So my threat of the week here is actually nuclear proliferation, right? We're seeing sort of this slow eroding of the norms that came about after we kind of abandoned mutually assured destruction during the Cold War.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it seems like we're heading toward a little bit of a shift, almost the Overton window, if you will, of sort of what we accept as far as nuclear weapons testing and proliferation. And that's a dangerous place, I think, to be for the U.S.
When I read these things, I was reminded of like the clock's trying to strike midnight, right? Like that was the old sort of way to look at it. And it feels like a couple more minutes and seconds have been chipped off.
It sure seems that way. So thank you for that. Of course, a huge thanks to John Bentivegna, the Chief Master Sergeant of the U.S. Space Force, for that great interview from Space Power 2025 in Orlando last week. And of course, a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.